me back on the podcast today is Dane Baker, who did an episode with me at the end of last year all about Reds. And today he has kindly let me pick his brain all about training availability and what on earth that means. But how do we link that to better performance as a triathlete? So welcome back, Dane.
Thanks. It's good to be back.
Yeah. Your episode went off, by the way.
Oh,
so thank you for that.
Thank you.
So what I wanted to pick your brain on is training availability, because, when we look at aspects of athletes, we always think, you're going to be a good athlete if you're fast. You've got speed, you've got power, you've got endurance, you've got strength. But the more consistent you are with training and the more training you can piece together is going to lead to better performance and helping you reach your goals, which a lot of athletes don't actually think about. And it's something that I was introduced to when I worked for Triathlon Australia. It's something we actually tracked in our athlete monitoring system, is like how many days of training have they got in a block. And you can see so clearly when you've got that data that more time spent training and piecing together solid training blocks has led to good outcomes compared to athletes that have, interruptions to training for illness or injury or whatever it is. They don't lead to better outcomes. So to kick us off, for people that have no idea what I'm talking about, what is training availability?
Well, yeah, I guess it's just the ability to train or be available to play. So I guess there's two ways you can look at this. You've got your endurance type athlete, where training availability is key, and we can go into a little bit about what's been looked at in that respect. And then from a team sport, you've got match availability.
Yeah.
And there's been lots of work done in that around FIFA have done a lot of work in that. Having those key players available is a key metric for your outcome. And that's why they're paid the big money. And the two main elements that you're going to miss training or miss matches is injury or illness. And injury can be a lot harder to predict, but we know there's some pretty nice correlations with getting the nutrition on track that can assist in avoiding missing training. And if the illness is severe, there's nutritional interventions that may reduce the severity, which means that you've missed less days.
Yes. I don't kind of think about team sports because I'm an endurance sports dietitian, but it's no brainer, isn't it? If your key striker or your goalie is sick, that's not going to lead to a good outcome for that team or that game. So really, really, really important, isn't it, in a team sport situation that your key
Especially
players
now
are
as
actually
well,
available?
Professional sports and salary caps, and you'll have your key star, and if they're unavailable, I think sometimes it's 30 or 40% less like win rate. There's all sorts of data on famous athletes that have had that. So yeah, keeping these athletes healthy and out there is key.
Yeah. So if we think, can I get you to put your endurance hat on for me?
Yep.
Because the listeners are triathletes. What are some of the things that they could maybe monitor as metrics to check on their training availability and see as a performance outcome?
Yeah, so I guess I'm not in that space all the time as like a coach or medical practitioner, but what the studies have looked at is kind of affected training weeks. And so I guess you could mark like if that week was affected by illness or an injury. And in the studies I've looked at, one of the key ones in Australia, which we can go into, was even like 1 day of affected training was classified as an affected training week.
Yeah.
So that can be something that I'm sure there's ways that you can track that in your training peaks and so on.
Yeah, Training Peaks has got a beautiful traffic light system where everything either is green or it's orange or it's red. So you should be able to really quickly visually see that if you use that as a platform, or set yourself up a spreadsheet or something if you don't use that.
Yeah, absolutely. So being able to train, and I guess that's what we talk to a lot about athletes, and I guess the importance of nutrition is we're often thinking about these 1 to 2% ergogenic aids that might influence performance, and the amount of work that's done in that, where there's some huge implications if you have an affected season with illness. So it's the big rocks and that's what coaches want. They just want consistency in training. And if we can provide that and do everything possible around, nutrition recovery, then that's going to go a big way for these athletes to sort of get, meet their goals for the season.
Yeah, the sprinkles on the icing on the cake, right? We actually need to build that cake base first and have that solid foundation, those big rocks that you're talking about, before we ice it for those sprinkles to even stick to anything. But
yes,
athletes are very good at doing sprinkles first.
I think especially in the developing athletes, when you're trying to build that years and years of consistent training to make them more robust and durable, and these interventions that can impact on that, I think we need to be aware that they can be quite devastating to the long-term sort of success of the athlete.
Yeah. So what are some of those big rocks to help an athlete improve their training availability?
Yeah, so I guess probably at the moment the research has changed a little bit to what are the key causes. And a lot of the work, so I'm going to reference quite a lot of work from Neil Walsh, who, if anyone out there does a bit of reading, you can often find him presenting on YouTube, or his key review was, I've got the paper here somewhere.
I'll link it in the show notes if somebody does want to get nerdy and read it.
So it's a sports medicine review from 2019 around changing the paradigm of immunity in athletes.
Yeah.
Where he talks a lot about early on, a lot of the work was looking at nutritional interventions that might help immune resistance, so stop the athlete getting sick. Where now he's looking at this paradigm around immune tolerance. So the athlete can still get sick, but their immune system is primed to tolerate that illness. And it probably doesn't make sense for them to have this huge immune response to stop the illness occurring. But maybe with a good immune system, we can tolerate the illness. Maybe we can train through it. Or worst case, we can miss maybe 2 or 3 days instead of 7 days from the illness.
Yep.
And the big sort of change in that is a lot of that early work didn't start to include life stress, sleep disruption, the psychology of the athlete. It just really looked at nutrition and illness. And he kind of talks about a lot of those studies were set up to fail because there was probably no likelihood that nutritional intervention was going to stop someone getting it.
Yeah.
So I think stress, sleep, lifestyle all goes as our key factors, and then nutrition plays a role in all of those factors as well and around recovery. Where probably the early days around this immune window or athletes having an impaired immune system is probably not that accurate way of thinking at the moment.
Okay, cool. So complete shift in the way we think about that, and good to introduce some of those new rocks. Not even new, but we probably know that sleep's going to affect our immune system. We probably know that stress is going to affect our immune system. But putting it all into a big puzzle that you can piece together, and seeing if there's factors in your life that you can control to help all of those things.
Yeah, and I think one of the things as well is that, like we talked about earlier, is that consistency in training. So if you are getting ill, the evidence shows you're high risk of getting ill again within the next 3 or 4 weeks, and you're starting to lose that consistency in the training. So it's kind of it just keeps building if you get it wrong.
So rest if you're sick.
Yeah, rest if you're sick, and then be really smart about how you reintroduce the training rather than most people want to go straight back in. But like those that are lucky enough to have a good coach will understand this and loading, but our weekend warriors, I think that's probably another discussion around how you reintroduce yourself to training.
Yeah. Do you have any tips on that? I did do a podcast episode way back in the way, actually, if somebody wants to dive into it, about managing a return to training. What sort of practical tips do you have for us around somebody that maybe has got sick? What can they do to slowly build back without killing themselves if they're at higher risk of getting sick in 3 to 4 weeks' time?
Yeah, it's probably a little bit out of my sort of field around returning from illness, but from the research I've sort of read through these papers that look at nutrition, it's often around athletes aren't often resting enough when they've got the illness.
Yep.
So they're training through it. And if the illness is severe enough, and that's when trying to understand what the actual illness is, whether it's from the neck down, whether it's actually an infection, or whether it's just an upper respiratory tract, like trying to figure out the type of illness you have, that can just create periods of prolonged stress and longer to recover. And I think figuring out the level of rest that you need, and that's where ideally, if you've got medical support, sports physicians to talk you through this, but then just gradually increasing the load. So that has shown in the research is that one of the biggest risks, if you've had an illness 2 to 3 weeks prior, there's a high risk of illness. So, and there's obviously other things that come with that. There's stress, there's all sorts of things, but I think reintroducing, getting that load right and working with an expert in that field would be the best.
Yeah, talk to your coach, get a plan from a qualified professional.
Yeah, and I think that's where I like, as myself, as a weekend warrior, when I first started without having a coach, is you would get these little bits of illness and then you'd have this generic plan and you wouldn't know, how do I get back on the plan?
Yeah.
And you have that real high motivation. And I think that's where you kind of set yourself up to fail, to just jump back onto the plan.
Yeah, or missing a long run and feeling like you've got to catch it up and feeling guilty for that missed training too, I think is really important.
Yep. So yeah, more to have a coach to kind of talk these things through and individualize your training load.
Yeah. So because we're both sports dietitians and we're both food nerds, what are some things that an athlete could do to help with their immune system, either like to make it more robust to prevent being sick, or if you do feel like you're coming down with something, what are some of the key things that we can do to help support our immunity?
Yeah, so there's probably different ways that we look at this now, and that's what Neil Walsh's paper tries to sort of look at a bit more detail, is around the concept of these nutritional interventions that might assist in immune tolerance rather than resistance. So he sort of coins the term tolerogenic supplements.
Yeah,
And
love it.
those are probably the key things we've seen, are zinc and vitamin C. And zinc actually binds to the illness, so it actually binds to the pathogen. And he talks about, like, if you think about, probably the simplest way to think about it is these tolerogenic supplements might reduce inflammation, and they might just be able to tolerate the illness. And that's where there's a bit of both there with zinc and vitamin C, but that's not going to prevent the illness. It's actually an intervention when you've got ill that shows that it might reduce the severity of the illness. And probiotics would be a similar one. So there's some pretty good research to show that can decrease the incidence, but also shortening the effect of the illness. And vitamin C. So vitamin C for us, we always know that there's that toss-up effect of training adaptation, but I guess identifying the high risk times that you might be competing, like when you're traveling, maybe if you've got an athlete that's got a history of illness. And we're not talking high doses here, anywhere from 500 to 1,000 milligrams a day, where a lot of that early work was really super high doses. But again, it's maybe picking your time over your training program when you might do that. Other things are vitamin D, and probably just depends on the time of where you are in the world as far as your vitamin D levels, what time you're training, if you're indoors or outdoors. In New Zealand, it's hard to get a vitamin D test, but if you can get that tested across different stages, there's a little bit more work to be done in polyphenols, but there does seem to be some really nice properties that he would term sort of tolerogenic that is worth including. And those are all really like your dark coloured fruit and vegetables, your berries. In New Zealand, we have a really potent polyphenol blackcurrant. So those kind of things that can be useful. And a lot of those, especially around polyphenols, there's going to be other benefits around recovery and just nutrient density. It's going to be no harm. And the other things which haven't shown as much evidence is glutamine. So that's often one that we toss up a lot in nutrition. A lot of that work was done in elderly and really immune compromised patients, where our athletes aren't probably going to be in that situation. Bovine colostrum is an interesting one, but there's just a really low level of studies to have much support. So there's probably more work to be done in that. And echinacea, again, very limited support. So probably your big ones are your zinc and vitamin C. If you do get sick, vitamin C maybe as a prevention to help reduce the incidence of the illness, in your probiotic.
So all I'm hearing you say is eat more fruits and vegetables.
Yep. That can help. But with the zinc, you kind of need to start getting a pretty high dose. So it is more of a targeted strategy. But definitely, and that's where it's just your fundamentals of trying to get, variety in your diet. And the whole area we haven't talked about is the gut microbiome, and the work that's been done in that area is just really evolving. But we know a lot of that is immune cells are in the gut. And so the more variety that you can have. Energy availability is an interesting one. Neil Walsh talks that's something that's potentially argued in the literature, but I don't think it's going to do any harm to make sure your energy availability is right. But we do see a lot of patients that are diagnosed with RED that really miss a training. So I don't think it kind of goes hand in hand with illness.
Yeah, and something that you said earlier there that I just want to highlight, because a lot of people don't actually know this, is that we don't want to be taking like a high dose vitamin C supplement or anything like that, because those high dose antioxidants can actually blunt the adaptive response to exercise. And there's actually quite a lot of supplements that are being marketed to triathletes very heavily at the moment that are a very high dose in antioxidant. I'm not going to mention any names, but Dane is not saying to do that. He's not saying to say that. You can easily meet your requirements just by having fruits and vegetables with something like vitamin C super easily.
Yep. And one of the things I've actually struggled with is it's actually quite hard to find these supplements in the right dosage. So to get the amount of zinc that you're after, there's often these supplements with huge doses of vitamin C. So you end up getting 8,000 milligrams of vitamin C to get the zinc. So you're like, this is not. So you have to really look around to find those products. Typically, there are some good companies around that are a bit more focused on the evidence that can help. But again, it's figuring out the time. So maybe it's, we know when you travel to your competition, you've done that key training, you're exposed to a high risk environment. Maybe that's when it's 500 milligrams to 1,000 milligrams of vitamin C a day. Or maybe you're coming back from an illness. So you're not going to be really at that high end of sort of stressing the system. So again, it's trying to consider the risk and with all training and when you might use it.
Yep. Yeah. So being strategic around that use.
Yep. Yeah. Just not chronic high doses for sure.
Yeah. Which is smart, right? Got to be strategic around everything with nutrition. You can't just like be mediocre all the time. Let's be a bit smarter around what we're doing.
Yep. And the same with vitamin D. You'll often see vitamin D, and then I know you guys, like a lot of our elite athletes, they train all day outside and they're in summer environments. Even in the winter, they're often traveling to the Gold Coast and they're training for 3 or 4 days. So it's not as simple as just saying, for 3 months we don't get vitamin D.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So on travel, that's a key time where athletes do get sick. And often we travel for races. We might have to do a flight and that exposes us to pathogens and things like that. What can we do to increase our training availability and then the performance in that race to prevent coming down with something right at that key time when you're meant to perform?
Yeah, so the air travel is the challenge. And I think it's mainly because of exposure in those confined spaces for a long period of time.
We're a mask, people.
Yeah, and 6 years ago, this was a bit more, people didn't know this as much, but now with COVID, we've got a pretty good understanding. But it's just trying to limit that exposure. And that's the key part of this is you can have the best immune system, but it's maybe not going to stop you getting sick. And then it's around the education to athletes, washing hands, limiting touching spaces that are frequently touched, wearing a mask, doing all you can to reduce that exposure. That's key, especially when you're going into a situation where you need to be at your best, like, most times with athletes that they are. Well, the other flip side of the coin is probably those athletes that are competing regularly, that they're always traveling. So that might be your team sports. If you're constantly competing and you're on, like you're in the Diamond League and you're constantly going from competition to competition, then that travel, and it's not just on the plane, it's like in airports, it's in train stations, it's in crowds as well. So all of those things is just trying to limit. And sick teammates. So that's a lot of the time it's having good systems in place where you can pick up an illness before the flu goes right through your team. And that's a whole nother discussion, but trying to identify illness early and separate players and team members.
Or your jammy kids.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then what about on the way home? Because I know a lot of triathletes will cross the finish line and then stop thinking about nutrition whatsoever. So what are some things that can prevent us from getting sick on the way home? Because it's really common to see athletes like 1 or 2 weeks later after a key event come
Yep.
down with something because it's been a huge stressful event and their immune system's compromised, and then they switch off thinking about nutrition.
Yeah, so I think the key thing is when you are faced with travel is potentially thinking about those nutritional interventions that might increase the immune system around the tolerance. So that could be using a probiotic for a couple of weeks prior to travel. Maybe it's using vitamin C on those days that you're traveling or for the week around that sort of competition. A lot of this research comes from sort of prolonged observational studies in elite athletes, and there was a really good one done in elite Norwegian cross-country skiers, where they looked over sort of 8 years of sort of research and tried to figure out what were the reasons why these athletes were missing training because of their illness. And they actually, that was the key thing around travel. So they were 5 times more likely to report a symptom following travel in the 2 days following. And there was a bigger risk for the return flight. And that's probably coming from the fatigue, really kind of emptying the tank in some of these races and getting on in a sort of compromised state. But maybe there's a whole lot of other factors around exposure. You go out to a nightclub, there's a huge amount of exposure. You get on the plane, you're compromised. And so I think maybe we just forget as well once we've done the competition.
Yeah,
That's
it doesn't
probably
matter
a
so
bigger thing.
much.
Yep. But definitely that's something that I've learned a lot around is a homeward flight is really important, especially in an athlete that's regularly competing or a team sport. You could be on the plane the next week. So and a lot of that, it came down to planning. So one of their key learnings was avoiding travel that day. So maybe you've competed. It's really nice thought to let's just get straight back on the plane and get back into bed at home.
Yeah.
But maybe you're better just to have a nice recovery day, wake up late, and then travel home.
Yeah, that's a good tip. If you can afford it as an age
Yep.
group athlete, spend a bit of time there afterwards as well. Because we often go in somewhere early and then
Yep.
try and get home as quickly as possible and get thrown straight back into full-time work, family, kids, all that sort of stuff. And yeah, that's when we often hit the deck a week or two later.
Yeah, and it's when you're exposed to those crowds and that sort of nutritional state, I think that's when the immunity is maybe compromised.
Yeah, I love it. I love like it kind of comes back full circle to training availability. If you're then sick after that, then you can't get back into training. And so it depends what's next. But
Yep.
with triathlon, most people are racing frequently through the season. It's rare to have, a good 12 months off racing or something like that. You've usually got something coming up in the next month or 2 or 3.
Yeah, and that's what the study looked at because these guys were in Europe and they're constantly traveling to Europe to competition and races. And what another thing they often find in these studies, which is repeated time and again, is it's generally the last sort of 2 months prior to the big competition where there's highest risk of illness,
Yep.
where injury is often earlier in the season. So again, it's as maybe that competition looms and you've got an athlete that's got a sort of compromised history, that's when you might start looking at these interventions or just paying a lot more closer attention to their nutrition, to their sleep, because it's something that's just the risk kind of gets higher and higher.
Yeah, and like you said, those big rocks, like they're the things that are going to make the biggest impact. It's not the little sprinkles on the icing on the cake. It's like getting enough sleep, keeping your stress levels low, trying to absorb that training, and I guess fueling that peak of training load really well as well, so that there is that periodization across a build. It doesn't
Yep.
just stay the same all the time.
Yep, absolutely. And a lot of that then I think, because we know sleep is so important, that I think there's a lot of nutritional work and around just all of those big rocks will mean that sleep's improved as well. So yeah, it's just a big kind of everything affects the other piece.
Yeah, multifactorial as always. It's not just one magic bullet to help you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the other area which we haven't sort of talked about is caffeine, and just having the awareness if you are using caffeine at a really high level of a high dose, that there is a risk that could be affecting sleep. And I think especially in our weekend warriors where you've got a full-time job, you're training in the afternoon, it's, you're often training late, and that has its challenges as well around sleep, fitting this in. But there are things that you can do nutritionally to just, try to get as much sleep as possible. So that's always something I think we should think about as practitioners.
Yeah, and I always think about a race. If you're doing something like an Ironman and you're having Coke in the back end of a run, that's at night time, right before you're going to go to sleep, there's still that caffeine in your system for a long period of time. So you're probably not going to have a very good sleep after a race like that. So your recovery
Yeah,
is
I guess the other
compromised.
side of that is like, you're not, you're probably not training again for a week or two. But it's probably the afternoon. We see a lot of like, team sport players that will rely on pre-workout and late in the development players, especially when they're training at night. And then it just, that's something I think when you are seeing athletes with repeated illness to just keep a bit of an eye on.
Yeah, good tips. So many good tips. So training availability and making sure that you don't get sick. Dane's given you some really good suggestions for what you can do to make sure that you are being consistent with training, because at the end of the day, that's like the biggest rock to perform better, is actually how much time can you piece together consistently training without it being interrupted. So thank you so much for that. That was awesome.
No worries. Thanks for having me.
If somebody wants to find you, where do they go about doing that?
Yeah, so if you just look on the Axis Sports Medicine website, just look us up at axissportsmedicine.co.nz, or I try to keep active on LinkedIn as a social media from time to time.
I'll link those in the show notes if somebody does want to stalk you, Dane. But thank you so much for your time and letting me pick your brain on training availability.
No worries. Thanks for having me.
Yoo-hoo!